We hear stories of war and the tales of the standout humans that we regale as heroes who hold firm in the face of fear, trauma, and incredible loss. The people who risk their safety, their way of life, and their very existence to ensure the safety, way of life, and right to existence of others. Many of these individuals, brave men and soldiers, have been decorated and celebrated throughout history. If I asked you to name a female war hero, could you? Names like Joan of Arc, Florence Nightingale, and Sarah Emma Edmonds might be among some of the few you might recognise. Women who dedicated their lives to the pursuit of peace and protection of their people. Today we are headed to Bruny Island in Tasmania, the southernmost state of Australia, a country that is not historically known for the war that raged within it or the heroes that fought through it. In fact, the hero in this story, who dedicated her life to the preservation of her people and their safe return to their traditional lands, was not regaled for her fight. Instead, after a lifelong imprisonment, she was wrongly identified as the last survivor of her race, her death marking a job well done to her captors. How wrong they were about it all. The team at If These Trees Could Talk wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Wanneroo Nation. We would like to recognise that we are sharing our stories from the stolen lands of our nation's first storytellers. Our conversations in many ways follow their traditions of storytelling and sharing knowledge and experience. We wish to pay our respect to the Wanneroo elders and ancestors, as well as extend that respect to all First Nations people, including our listeners, and acknowledge and honour their continued connection to the land and waters that have been the inspiration for the stories we share. What I didn't expect was to turn up there and have my beliefs about our country shift on their axis. Well, how is this any different to what's going on in Gaza? Better they die here where they are cared for than at home where they are shot by the depraved section of the white community. That's his words. This makes me really sad. Before we start today's story, I just want to provide a few trigger warnings. The stories contain names and details of Aboriginal people who have passed. Some of the treatment of the people in today's story is abhorrent, and we will cover aspects of sexual and physical abuse. There is not a lot about this story that is easy to listen to. It's also not easy for me to tell. So before we head forward, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. And if this isn't for you, we completely understand, and we hope that we will see you for the next episode.
I just want to assure everybody that Shannon is actually a really fun person, one of the funnest people I know, but this is not the episode where you're going to see that side of her personality. So if you're after that and some more lighthearted stories, please jump forward and listen to some other episodes. This one is not for you.
Hi friends, thanks for joining us for the very first episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you are not one of our friends or families and have just happened to find us by accident, thank you for being here. My name is Shannon. I am a traveller, explorer. I have a passion for history, spooky tales, survival stories, and nature. And I am joined by Megan.
Hi.
Who is our producer and has graciously allowed me to just come in here and tell her all of the stories and all of the tales of my trips and my explorations. You generally won't find me on our travels, hanging out in theme parks and those types of places. We're off the grid kind of people. I travel with my family, and we love camping and hiking and national parks, and everything that we do revolves around nature and history and exploring the beautiful parts of our country, generally away from all of the peoples.
Are you looking at me because you'd like me to introduce myself?
I just thought that maybe that would be a good spot for you to do it.
Okay. It's always really hard when people ask you who you are and to put it into a sentence. Really difficult. I guess you could say I am a mother, a teacher, and an experience collector.
Today we're heading to Tasmania, which is my favourite state. We travelled there about 8 or 9 years ago for the very first time. I've had a few trips since. And the reason that I have decided to do this story first is because this trip was significant for lots of reasons. I have 3 children. At the time, we had a baby. So Charlie was probably about 2 years old and the older kids were still primary school age. It was probably the first really, really big trip that we did. So there was a lot of challenges just logistically of how you fit enough stuff for all of those people into a car. And we managed that part of it. What I didn't expect to experience was what has become, I think, a part of who I am and the way that I look at history and our country. Tasmania is one of the most beautiful places as far as nature's concerned that I've ever seen. And every turn you're just faced with a new environment or something breathtakingly beautiful. It is the place where I have literally been lost for words more than any other place that I have visited. But the thing that got me, this trip was, we're going to tick off the highlights. We're going to do Port Arthur and we're going to do Hobart and we're going to do Cradle Mountain and we're going to do the big ticket items. We've got 2 weeks and it was fast paced between all of them. So I remember my pop saying to me when I was little and he had his first trip to Tasmania that it was like stepping back in time, and I was so looking forward to the colonial aspect and the buildings and the architecture and the story of the first settlers. What I didn't expect was to turn up there as a mum of young children and have my beliefs about our country shift on their axis. Today, I'm going to talk about Truganini. I have heard differing pronunciation of Truganini's name. I have heard Truganini, I have heard Truganini. I have looked online and I have found it equal for both. I want to get this stuff right. I take this seriously, and if throughout today's episode I pronounce this in the wrong way, you have my sincerest apologies. The reason that I'm sharing this story is because I have nothing but the utmost respect for this woman. If we go back to the beginning, and when I say beginning, I'm not talking about our Indigenous history, I'm talking about our colonial history, and we're going to head to about 1830. At that time, about 1 million acres of land in Tasmania had been granted to European settlers, which of course pushed the Indigenous people away from the settlements that they were creating. There was hostility as they were losing the places that they had traditionally called their homes, their hunting grounds, their water sources, because they needed the same things to survive as the white settlers did. But the white settlers had guns and a very simple solution to what they saw as a particular problem, and that was eradicating the Indigenous Tasmanians. So while this was happening on mainland Tasmania, there was communities of people that lived outside of where those settlements were who this part wasn't really affecting. And where we're going to go to first, and we will come back to mainland Tasmania, is Bruny Island, which is a stunning little island south of Hobart, right at the bottom of Tassie. It is a beautiful place to visit, and it is a draw card for a lot of tourists now, but back then it was just home to the Truganini people, and it was I say safe space for them, but it really wasn't even prior to British colonisation, because the British were not the first interactions that the Tasmanian people had with white people. It was a place, especially the coastal areas, that was really popular with sealers, whalers. The water surrounding Tasmania was full of resources that these people wanted, and they travelled long ways on their own, on ships, big groups of men, and would use the shores of Tasmania as a refuge from life at sea. There was some trading in place, and not all of the interactions were negative, but a lot of it was. So Truganini and her community had been existing on Bruny Island, travelling between there and the stretch of water between there and the mainland. Her father was an elder in that community and was well regarded. But the issues on the mainland, and obviously I can't speak to what the people in these coastal communities understood or knew at the time. When Truganini was about 18, a white man called George Augustus Robinson made his way to Bruny Island with a plan. He was a missionary, and he had a plan that he would set up a settlement there. His goal is debated, and it depends on where you look in history, because he was being paid by the government to set up these missions. Land prices was a real issue, like in the settlements, because of the fighting and the conflict between the white settlers and the Indigenous people. As the settlers went further afield and started setting up homesteads on land, there were battles. The Indigenous people fought back. They burnt down dwellings, and people were speared, and the white people fought back with guns, and it was nasty. So this affected land prices, and that was the real issue for the government, was that they needed the Indigenous people gone, because you weren't going to pay good money, or white people weren't going to pay good money for land where they were going to go out and their families were going to be in danger. So George Augustus Robinson was hired. He was a Cockney bricklayer from Britain who came to Tasmania and was working in a missionary role. So he literally believed the Bible and heaven and hell, and, that his job on earth was to go out and convert people to Christianity. And that was his goal. He was going to go out and see if he could teach the Aboriginal people how to be white, basically. He ended up in Bruny Island. He set up a mission there and offered the Indigenous people in the area a safe space where they could exist, and they would have supplies, and they would be safe from what was going on the mainland. Historically, people have looked at Truganini's motivations for helping George Augustus Robinson. And I'm going to go back to prior to his arrival, and I just want to put a trigger warning in here because her life was harsh and it was full of trauma. She had lost her mother. Her sisters had been captured and taken by sealers. The man that she was going to marry, so we'll call him her fiancé, a group of them were transported to the mainland by sailors, and the men were thrown overboard. When the men, including her fiancé, tried to swim back to the boat, the sailors cut their hands off, and those men drowned in the sea while the women watched on. Those women were then held captive by those sailors, and you can imagine the fate without me going into the gory details of the types of things that would happen to those women when the men had been disposed of. So that is the life that she knew before she met George Augustus Robinson. It was a life of harshness. I believe her dad remarried after she lost her mum, and I think her stepmother was killed as well, and her dad died not long after, and from all accounts it was from a broken heart. He had watched his daughters be taken, his wives die, the women of his tribe who it was his job to protect and care for be raped by white men and shot and slaughtered. You can understand why when this man turns up without a gun, a white man, and says, I want to take care of you guys, I want to help you, what that would feel like for those people. At this stage, Truganini had no family left. The man she was going to marry was gone. I don't know, I'm assuming there was other community members still there around her, but if someone promises you, I want to protect you, and you're 18 years old and you are a girl who is incredibly vulnerable, why that promise might seem like a really great idea. George Augustus Robinson's first year on Bruny Island was about making plans for the mission, what it would look like, how it would operate, but it was a complete and utter failure. The people that he brought in died from European disease. They had no immunity to the things that they were being exposed to, and then they were being forced into confinement. They had never lived in that way prior, so they're in small dwellings on top of each other, not in open spaces. It was inevitable that disease would spread amongst them, and they had no chance against that stuff. A lot of them were dying in confinement, which was so opposite to how they lived. And it just is a pattern that repeats throughout this story, not just in Bruny Island, but in all the places that they tried to set up these missions. The biggest issue then was that the Aboriginal people who were in this space, their customs and traditional law was that when somebody dies, you vacate that area to not be around the spirits of the dead. So they're living in this place where people are dying constantly, but they're locked in, they're imprisoned there, and they can't move away. So that was causing unrest within the community as well. So they could see that this wasn't going to work. Bruny Island was not going to be a safe place to be able to collect and bring other people. So Robinson and Governor Arthur made a plan which they put into place, and that was for Robinson, with the help of Truganini and some of the other people from Bruny Island, to go into the bush and make contact with communities and a deal for peace.
He had good intentions.
He did.
With the knowledge that he
had and his biblical beliefs. But there's also a flip side to that coin, and that is that this was his job. He was being paid to do this. The government's plan was to eradicate Indigenous people in Tasmania. At the time that he was on Bruny Island, what they term as the Black War was occurring on the mainland. There was bounties on Aboriginal people's heads. Shoot them. We'll pay you, is the message that people on the mainland are receiving. For him to go out and want to protect them, you would assume that he was invested in their future and their protection. But at the same time, the way we talk about KPIs in our own job, if he rounded them up and got them away from where people were buying land, there were big financial incentives involved for him, and notoriety and fame and glory for a job well done. We have access to his diaries, and there is information that at times would kind of lend to both sides, like two things can be true at once. For me, going into this and thinking about this, it's really hard to find a camp to sit in, whether I'm like, yes, George, or I hate you, George. I can't really figure where I sit there. But I think my reflection is more about Truganini and what she was trying to achieve. Truganini became the negotiator. She didn't, I keep going back to her motivation, and did she think this was a great idea, but what choice did she have? If she didn't help, what was her fate in that situation? She did the brunt of the work. Robinson was the one getting the pat on the back, but Truganini and the people with her were the people going out. They were negotiating. They were the people who understood language and custom and tradition, and they were the people that were doing the convincing that this isn't safe for us anymore. If we want to survive, we need to trust this man.
I can only imagine how difficult that would be.
Yeah.
With their past experience of white men.
That is exactly right. So there was obviously with the elders animosity. They were scared, like they'd never met this man before. Their interactions with white men had never been great. But the fate of their families and their communities, they knew how bad it was. They were dying, and they had to make a choice. Can we do this on our own, or do we take this offer and head away? So Robinson always travelled unarmed because he wanted to show the elders that he was not there to hurt them, which he did at his peril. He didn't know whether these people were going to turn up and spear him, or whether, they'd throw him in a river, or what kind of wildlife that they would meet while they were out there. Obviously, the group of Indigenous people that he was travelling with were better equipped to deal with that. And they were crossing a river at one point, and he fell in, and Truganini saved his life because he couldn't swim. And she could, and she swam out with logs that he clung to and then swimming back to shore. So this was so perilous for him. So you kind of have to take that into consideration as well. Like, this isn't an easy job. He's going places that white people have never been before and negotiating with the Indigenous people to follow him. But, I mean, he could have been killed at any turn. So there was risk associated to him as well. The other issue was that often when they would approach, the communities would see them and they would flee and set the bush on fire as they went, which was a protection mechanism. One of the big calling cards for these friendly missions was an elder called Malanagana, and I'm hoping that I have that right. Robinson pursued him knowing that if he could convince him that other people would follow. They would trust his judgment. He was well known throughout not just his own community, but other communities as a warrior and a wise man. And if he said yes, then the other people would follow as well. Malanagana also had a sense of duty towards his own community and his own race, and he had the desire to preserve that as well. So he accepted Robinson's offer. He can see that his people are dying, and he's not confident anymore of his ability to be able to protect them. So Robinson convinces them to accompany him, and they then act to spread the word against other communities. While this is all happening, the concept of the Black Line is forming. So while Robinson is on the friendly missions, he hears of a strategy that's being employed by Governor Arthur. Governor Arthur urges every white man in the colonies to join, and what he's forming is basically an army. The design is to form a line that crosses a big area, and that they are just going to walk with guns and ammunition and dogs to drive the natives into a corner. 2,200 white men join with 1,000 stands of arms, 30,000 rounds of ammunition, and 300 sets of handcuffs, and they form a line and they start walking. So what Governor Arthur has done is handed ammunition to convicts and said, go out and fix this problem for us. Once Robinson learns that this is what's happening and there are people within the Indigenous communities are hearing of people's experiences of the Black Line moving through, the threat of that became Robinson's biggest bargaining tool. That if you come with me, you are going to be safe. I'm going to keep you safe from these people. There's a quote that I'm going to share from Robinson's diary. So it's directly his words. I described to them the formation of the line by tracking it on the ground with a stick and informed them that at the time the mighty enemy were engaged with capturing their countrymen and would shortly appear in formidable array in front of their own territory. They complained in bitter terms of the injuries to which they had been exposed through the medium of the whites. I recommended them to accompany me without delay.
What choice they have?
There's no choice. The Black Line, too, was a failure, like everything that they tried to put together. It captured one old man and a young boy. And that's what they brought back to Governor Arthur. So as they raged through the bush with the guns and the handcuffs, it didn't work the way that they wanted it to. But Robinson, however, is much more successful, and his fame is increasing. So Robinson manages to gather around about 300 Aboriginal people who follow him. His notoriety with Governor Arthur is rising because he's managed to do what these 2,000 men with guns and dogs and handcuffs couldn't do. So Robinson's fame and notoriety was rising. He was doing a great job. They were super happy with what he was doing. Robinson took his group and travelled towards Flinders Island, where they were assured by Robinson that they would be safe and cared for until they could return to their country. And this is the thing that you have to remember. Every promise that Robinson made to the Indigenous people was that you come with me, I will protect you until we can negotiate a peaceful deal, and then you will be returned to your land. I don't know that any one of these people would have agreed to go with him if they had known that there were parts of his story that weren't true. But again, what choice did they have?
Do you think he believed it?
I don't know if he believed it. I want to believe that he believed it. But when you hear how the story ends, if it was me, if I was that person, and I'm saying that here and now in my comfortable house with my recording equipment in front of me, not living in that time or in the way that they lived or under the conditions that they lived, if I had committed myself to that and I believed in God and I believed that my mission was God-given and it was to protect these people, how at any point can you turn and walk away? Which is ultimately what he did once he got his rewards. The group headed towards Flinders and they were promised that they would be returned to their country. So by the time they reached Flinders Island, 2/3 of the 300 people had died of European diseases by being confined together in jails and transit camps. We've just lived through COVID. We have seen ourselves firsthand what having no immunity to a virus can do. But what choice did they have? They'd already left. So they just kept travelling. They arrive at Flinders Island and the arrival is celebrated by Robinson. They settle in a little town called Wyballina and he orders a feast and fireworks as a celebration for the arrival. That's a wonderful concept for him to celebrate that. But 1/3 of the people who left on that journey are now there and they've reached a colonial settlement. And this is where they're going to live now, in houses. They're no longer allowed to practice their own law and ceremony. I'm not sure if fireworks and a feast is the way that they want to handle the arrival at this town. But for Robinson, it was a great thing. He had got them again to an offshore island away from the mainland and the main settlements of Tasmania. They were definitely not allowed to speak their own language. They weren't allowed to participate in ceremony. They were subjected to a regime that was basically a crash course in becoming white. He taught them about Christianity, and that was not part of the agreement. They had their own spiritual beliefs and their own history, and once they were there, they could see that this wasn't what he had promised.
Our history is never not alarming. It doesn't matter how many stories you hear.
No. It was so different to what I was taught or what I knew. And I think this is why learning about this was such a smack in the face for me. I grew up thinking that we'd never had a war in Australia. Mm-hmm. How is this not a war? How is this any different to what's going on in Gaza? They're setting up refugee camps on offshore islands for people because they want to take their land. Mm-hmm. It's no different, except that they don't have planes and bombs. Their deepest desire is that they want to maintain their beliefs and their culture and their heritage. The fact that that has been taken away from them is so traumatic. In the first year, another 29 people die, and there's only 90 people left. It's basically just a death camp. And again, they're on this island with the spirits of the dead. That is against everything that they believe in. Truganini is a witness to all of this. And so I keep finding myself in her position, like thinking of myself as an 18-year-old girl and thinking that you're doing this thing and you're trying to save your people, and then you're watching the people die around you. It's very different to a life where your sisters are being kidnapped and raped by sealers. George Augustus Robinson is kind to her, and he's not cruel to her. But what he's offering to her is a refugee camp where the people that she has made promises to are dying around her. Robinson wrote about the people dying in his diary. He didn't understand it, but many of the Aboriginal people would sit on the beach, facing west, looking towards their traditional lands. Some people would sit there when they died. He didn't understand it, but along with what they were experiencing, they were broken because they'd been removed from their homes and everything that they knew had been taken away from them. Robinson wrote in his diary, "Better they die here where they are cared for than at home where they are shot by the depraved section of the white community." That's his words. I don't know, how does that make you feel? Better they die here where they are cared for than at home where they are shot by the depraved section of the white community. So he's calling the people depraved. He's acknowledging that what they're doing is completely wrong, and it absolutely is. Is he right? Is it better that they die there where they're cared for? This is the thing where I wrestle with his intentions. I think he did think that was better. And possibly it is. I don't know. I can't make the judgment on that. But while this mission on Flinders Island is in existence, Sir Charles Darwin just happens to visit Tasmania and witness Wyberlena and the Aboriginal community there. He talks to people and learns about them dying. His experience in Tasmania at that time informs his theory on evolution. So something that then becomes the basis of scientific study for such a massive amount of scientists all over the world is based on this community on Flinders Island.
I had no idea.
Yeah. You can read Darwin's words about his observation of the community on Flinders Island.
How have I gotten to the age of 41 and not known this?
Do we not talk about this because as a nation of people who have come from colonisation, is it more comfortable that we don't know it?
Well, there's no denying that this conversation is not an easy conversation to listen to.
It's not an easy conversation to listen to. It's not an easy conversation to have. How do you put this in a concept that children understand? Mm-hmm. And we're coming off the back of years of a government that denied that any of this ever actually happened. Mm-hmm. Australia's constitution is the only constitution in the entire world that was written in a time of peace, is the claim that the government so proudly pinned to the settlement of our nation. It makes me feel sick. Is a dying culture a much prettier explanation than the truth of what was actually occurring? Is it more noble for a scientist to discover a dying race than it is to discover the barbaric treatment of a group of people who had lived for 60,000 years successfully and had thrived and raised families and were healthy and had loved and cared for the land in a way that's never occurred again since the country's been settled. Not long after Darwin's visit, Malanagana dies on Flinders Island without ever seeing his country again. His daughters had escaped, though, because they were living with sealers. And during this time, when Governor Arthur and George Augustus Robinson believed that the mainland of Tasmania was free of Aboriginal people, there were Malanagana's daughters, as well as countless numbers of other women who had chosen to marry sealers or whalers, who had been captured and taken against their will by sealers and whalers. There are islands dotted all through the Bass Strait that had populations of First Nation Tasmanians living on them. And while the government believed that the only existing community of Indigenous Tasmanians was living on Flinders Island, it was not true. There were people existing and living traditional lives in other areas that were off of the mainland. Robinson was quite famous now within the ranks of government as an Aboriginal expert, and he was offered a new job as the Chief Protector of Aborigines in the new settlement of Victoria. Robinson wants to take the remaining community with him, but the government resists, citing the downturn in land values in Victoria. But can we look at that part for just a second? He wanted to take them with him. The remaining
90
that were left on Flinders, he asked, can I take these people with me? Is that a notch on the positive side? Or is it that he's going to a new land with new people to impress, and previous to life on Flinders Island, his success was solely reliant on Truganini and the people in her community who helped him with his achievements? It's like a swinging pendulum, back and forwards. I can't know.
Just like so many stories that have been lost.
Yeah.
To really find out Truganini's side of the story.
That's right. So they agree to him taking a few from the community with him. And in 1839, Truganini and 14 others accompany George Augustus Robinson from Flinders Island, leaving 60 behind. We don't know George Augustus Robinson's exact reasons for wanting to take them. They had been successful negotiating tools in the past. And for the 14 that accompanied him, it might not have been the life that they wanted to live, but it was a life. And since they had arrived on Flinders Island, they had watched the people around them die. So is this again another situation where Truganini is choosing to live? She's going further away from her home. She's going further away from her people. She's leaving the people that she so desperately wanted to protect behind.
Yeah, but now she knows that the negotiations that she'd been working on, that they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain.
Yeah. And they're not living, they're living as white people. They're wearing clothes. They're eating flour and sugar and drinking tea and
Speaking English
and studying the Bible. Once they arrived in Victoria, Robinson realised that Truganini and the others were of little use to him, and so he cuts them loose. The group go off alone, abandoned, and are now in a place where they don't know the language, they don't know the land, they don't know where they're safe. There's already established colony of white people living in that space, and they're all alone. How do they get home? Where do they go from there? I can't imagine the decisions that they were faced with in that moment. And you question Robinson's decision-making and you go, he wanted to take all of them. He wanted to take all of them with him, you know. Did he want to protect them? But the minute that those 14 people didn't serve him anymore, he just let them loose. How can he have ever cared for any of them? How can this ever have been about anything other than political notoriety for him?
Yeah, I want to go back to all those times you asked those rhetorical questions throughout our conversation and rethink them now that I know the outcome. Is there more to the story?
There's just still one more little bit. That it's not redemption. I'm sitting in the same space you are. I cannot see him take those people and then just let them loose and say he was anything other than politically motivated. I've seen specs, I've read parts of his words, and I've hoped that during that time in a world that was so brutal for our First Nations Tasmanians, where they were hunted and killed and raped. The group go off alone, abandoned, and are faced with the same threat to their existence as they were in their homelands before they started this journey, but without protection from the white community and with no local knowledge. Truganini and 2 of her male companions are arrested for the murder of a sealer. Now, I can't find any more information on the murder of this man, how it occurred, or why. But all I can think of is Truganini and the life on Bruny Island that she had, and the treatment of her family by sealers. Why, in a place where they knew no one, they were exposed, they were vulnerable, why did they just murder a sailor? I don't think it was because so they could steal his boat. Mm-hmm. I think there was more to that. But I can't find further information on why that happened or how that occurred from my research capability perspective. I would really like to understand that part more. The 3 of them are arrested after the murder and taken to jail. Whilst in jail, Truganini is visited by Robinson and he gave evidence at her trial. Truganini herself is found not guilty. However, the men both were, and they were the first recorded hangings in Victoria. That is the end of Truganini's journey with Robinson. Robinson returns to London, now a very, very rich man, considered to be the utmost expert in Australian Aborigines. Truganini is returned to Flinders Island, where now 45 survivors remain. Those 45 survivors have little contact with the outside world until 1847, when they send a petition to the government. They complain about the new manager, who is cruel and unkind to them. They remind the government about their agreement to return them to their own land. The Aboriginal people had kept up their side of the bargain. They had taken their families and their children. They had vacated their lands and they had gone to the island just as they were told to do, with the promise that they would be allowed to return to their traditional lands. The government responds by returning them back to the mainland, but not to their homes. In 1847, they sailed to a mission in Oyster Cove, just south of Hobart. It was a deserted convict station. Okay, are you ready for this next bit? Sorry, it's not good. "46 people arrive at Oyster Cove. 20 years passed and only 3 survive. Truganini is one of them. In 1869, William Laney dies. His skull is stolen during the night. Not long after this, Truganini leaves Oyster Cove and she works and lives with a family close to Hobart. But she is petrified. She begs a friend to be buried in a river in the deepest place. She begs him, please don't let them cut me. Because of the scientific value for research and the belief that the race is almost near extinction and the belief that Australian Aboriginals are among the most primitive people on earth, the trade for artefacts and body parts of deceased Aboriginals is so massive at that time. They are exhuming bodies. They are shipping body parts around the world, some for research, some just because there's money to be made in the selling of these parts or tools to affluent families in Europe and England. Truganini was incredibly right to be worried about what would happen to her body upon her death. She is now wrongly regarded to be the last legitimate Tasmanian Aboriginal person alive. There was a lot at stake with that claim, not just for her, but for colonisers. They're so close to vanquishing the race that they had set out to get rid of. If you look at the Indigenous culture anywhere in any country, there's always the last of, the last Aztec, the last Eskimo. So for the government in Tasmania, the fact that she was the last Aboriginal, it was almost a job well done. It was almost time for them to pat themselves on the back. She's going to die. They're going to put up a statue and they can all shake hands and say, well done. We've done what we set out to do. This makes me really sad. Truganini dies on the 8th of May, 1876. She had the right to be afraid. She was buried within the grounds of a women's prison before her body was exhumed and her skeleton put on display in a Tasmanian museum. 100 years later, her people reclaimed her remains and scattered her ashes into the water as she had wished off Bruny Island, finally returning her to her home and the land and water of which she was a part of and that was a part of her.
It's been a fortnight since that episode has been recorded, and Shannon and I have just sat down and listened back again for, I think, maybe the 9th time for you, Shannon.
Yeah.
It doesn't get any easier to listen to. And we didn't want the episode to end At that point,
It felt abrupt when we listened to it back. Like it was just a boom. And that is where Truganini's story ends. But the legacy that she leaves, that is not the end of that. I can talk about it now without my voice cracking, which is a pleasant change because that was really such a hard story to tell. And it was a big one. And it's probably not a great first episode for me to go, hey, here I am. And, you know, this is our new little project. But the reason that I chose that is I wrote that episode when it was close to International Women's Day. And it was just because I was reflecting on people who I thought were amazing, women who I thought were amazing. And that story reminded me of that first visit to Tasmania and how much it changed my views and it shaped the way that I look at history and ultimately what I believe. Like, it is a dangerous thing to try and find empathy because to do that, you have to acknowledge your privilege and your life and how lucky you've been. I wrestled with that. But there were parts of learning her story where I did try and sit in that space and try and imagine what it would feel like for her. And the reason that I chose for it to be the first one that I did is because it so profoundly affected me and it has shaped the way that I look at everything from that time forward. When I'm starting a project where I'm talking about my travels and learning about history and my connection to nature and there'll be a whole pile of stuff that comes in throughout the time that I share some of this stuff. I just really wanted to start with something that was big.
meaningful.
Meaningful, yeah. So if you were able to make it through the whole lot of that episode, I know it was a lot. Thanks for being here. And we will see you again next week with something hopefully a little bit lighter. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like access to more information about the places or information included in today's episode, please visit our website at www.ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If These Trees Could Talk creative writer is Shannon Walters and it is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We would love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to joining you for our next adventure.